On August 3, 1861, John Ericsson walked into the office of Cornelius Bushnell, a Connecticut shipbuilder and railroad investor, carrying rolled blueprints for what he called an impregnable battery. The American Civil War had begun 4 months earlier, and the Union Navy desperately needed ironclad warships to counter reports that the Confederacy was building an armored vessel from the salvaged hull of the USS Merrimack. Bushnell had come to New York seeking Ericsson's opinion on a conventional ironclad design, but Ericsson dismissed it as inadequate. Instead, he unrolled his own drawings, showing a vessel unlike any ship ever built. A flat, iron-plated deck barely rising above the waterline, topped by a single revolving turret containing two massive guns. The design had no masts, no rigging, and almost no visible superstructure. Bushnell stared at the drawings in confusion. It looked like a raft with a cheesebox on top. He asked how such a strange vessel could possibly float, let alone fight. Ericsson's response was cold. "The sea shall ride over her, and she shall live in it like a duck." Bushnell took Ericsson's design to Navy Secretary Gideon Wells and the Ironclad Board, a committee of 3 senior naval officers tasked with evaluating proposals for armored warships. The board's reaction was immediate and hostile. Commodore Joseph Smith called it Ericsson's Folly. Commodore Hiram Paulding said the vessel would sink the moment it was launched. Commander Charles Davis declared it impractical, unseaworthy, and dangerous. The board unanimously rejected Ericsson's design, recommending instead 3 conventional ironclads with traditional hulls, masts, and broadsides. But Bushnell refused to give up. He arranged a meeting with President Abraham Lincoln, showing him Ericsson's model. Lincoln examined it skeptically, then reportedly said, "All I have to say is what the girl said when she put her foot into the stocking. It strikes me there's something in it." With Lincoln's tentative support, Wells overruled the Ironclad Board and authorized construction on September 15, 1861. Ericsson had 100 days to build a ship that would change naval warfare forever. John Ericsson was born Johan Ericsson on July 31, 1803, in Långbanshyttan, a mining district in central Sweden. His father, Olof Ericsson, was a mine inspector and engineer who struggled financially despite his technical skills. Young Johan showed extraordinary mechanical aptitude from early childhood, sketching machines and designing mining equipment by age 7. At age 13, he worked as a surveyor on Sweden's Göta Canal project, an ambitious engineering effort to connect Stockholm with Gothenburg across the width of Sweden. Stories circulated that workers followed the boy with a stool so he could reach survey instruments and blueprints. By age 14, Ericsson was directing crews of adult laborers, earning recognition as a prodigy. His education was entirely practical, learned from observing machines, studying engineering drawings, and solving problems through trial and experimentation. He never attended university, never studied formal engineering theory, and never received credentials from established institutions. At age 17, Ericsson joined the Swedish Army as a topographical officer, serving in the Jämtland Field Ranger Regiment. Military service provided him with discipline, precision, and access to workshops where he could experiment with mechanical designs. He became obsessed with steam engines, believing they represented the future of transportation and industry. In 1826, at age 23, Ericsson moved to London with fellow Swedish officer John Braithwaite, hoping to develop and market steam-powered machinery. The two men established an engineering partnership, designing and building a steam fire engine that impressed London authorities. Emboldened, they decided to compete in the Rainhill Trials of 1829, a competition sponsored by the Liverpool and Manchester Railway to select the best locomotive design. Ericsson and Braithwaite built the Novelty, a lightweight, high-speed locomotive incorporating innovative features, including a forced draft furnace and vertical cylinders. The Novelty reached speeds of 28 miles per hour, faster than any previous locomotive, and captivated spectators with its elegance and speed. But on the 3rd day of trials, the Novelty's boiler failed. A copper tube burst under pressure, forcing Ericsson and Braithwaite to withdraw. George Stephenson's Rocket, a heavier, slower, but more reliable locomotive, won the competition. Ericsson was devastated. He had designed what many considered the superior machine, but mechanical failure had cost him victory and the lucrative railway contracts that would have followed. The experience taught him a bitter lesson. Brilliance meant nothing without reliability, and innovation was worthless if it failed under pressure. Ericsson would spend the rest of his life obsessing over durability, testing his designs mercilessly, and building machines that worked under the harshest conditions. The Novelty's failure haunted him, driving him to prove that radical designs could be both revolutionary and dependable. In the 1830s, Ericsson developed the marine screw propeller, a revolutionary alternative to paddle wheels for ship propulsion. Paddle wheels were inefficient, vulnerable to damage, and performed poorly in rough seas. Ericsson's screw propeller, a spiral blade mounted below the waterline, provided constant thrust regardless of wave conditions, and was protected from enemy fire. In 1836, he patented his propeller design and demonstrated it on the Francis B. Ogden, a small iron vessel built in London. British naval authorities observed the demonstration but showed no interest, declaring paddle wheels perfectly adequate for existing fleets. Ericsson, frustrated by British conservatism and facing mounting debts, was approached by Captain Robert F. Stockton of the United States Navy, who recognized the propeller's potential. Stockton commissioned Ericsson to build a small iron steamship, the Robert F. Stockton, fitted with screw propellers and engines. The vessel successfully crossed the Atlantic in 1839, and Stockton invited Ericsson to immigrate to the United States. In America, Ericsson partnered with Stockton to design the USS Princeton, commissioned by the U.S. Navy in 1843 as the first steam-powered warship with screw propulsion and engines mounted below the waterline. The Princeton represented a quantum leap in naval architecture. Her engines were protected from shell fire, her propellers provided superior maneuverability, and she carried two massive 12-inch guns designed to outrange any ship afloat. Ericsson designed the engines, propellers, and one of the guns, called the Oregon, which he built using a revolutionary built-up construction method where red-hot iron hoops were shrunk onto the barrel, pre-stressing the metal and allowing it to withstand higher pressures. The Oregon gun was tested over 150 times without failure. Stockton, jealous of Ericsson's acclaim, commissioned a second gun called the Peacemaker, built without Ericsson's hooped construction. The Peacemaker was heavier, more impressive-looking, but structurally weaker. Stockton rushed it into service with minimal testing. On February 28, 1844, the Princeton hosted a ceremonial cruise down the Potomac River, carrying President John Tyler, cabinet members, congressmen, and over 400 guests. Stockton fired the Peacemaker repeatedly to impress dignitaries. Each discharge met with applause. On the final firing, the gun exploded catastrophically. The breech shattered, sending jagged iron fragments across the deck, killing 6 people, including Secretary of State Abel Upshur and Secretary of the Navy Thomas Gilmer. President Tyler, below deck at the moment of explosion, narrowly avoided death. Dozens were injured. The disaster shocked the nation and destroyed Stockton's career. Stockton, desperate to deflect blame, accused Ericsson of designing defective ordnance. A naval court of inquiry exonerated Ericsson, finding that the Peacemaker, not designed by him, was solely responsible. But the damage was done. Ericsson's reputation was tarnished, his partnership with Stockton dissolved, and the U.S. Navy viewed him with suspicion. For the next 17 years, Ericsson worked in obscurity, designing commercial vessels, experimenting with caloric engines, and nursing bitterness toward the naval establishment that had rejected his innovations. When the Civil War began in April 1861, Ericsson was 57 years old, living in New York City, and had not worked with the U.S. Navy since the Princeton disaster. He had spent years designing an ironclad warship incorporating a rotating gun turret, convinced that traditional broadside tactics were obsolete. His design placed all armament in a single revolving turret that could fire in any direction, eliminating the need for multiple gun batteries along the hull. The turret would be armored heavily enough to withstand any projectile, and the ship's low profile would present minimal target area. The entire vessel would float low in the water, with only the turret, pilot house, and smokestack visible above the surface. Ericsson believed this design would render wooden warships obsolete and revolutionize naval combat. But when he approached the Navy in the 1850s, his proposals were rejected. Admirals dismissed the concept as impractical, arguing that low freeboard vessels would swamp in rough seas and that revolving turrets were mechanically unreliable. The Confederate Navy's conversion of the Merrimack into an ironclad ram changed everything. Intelligence reports indicated the Confederates were plating the vessel with 4-inch iron armor, mounting 10 heavy guns, and installing a reinforced ram bow capable of smashing wooden hulls. Union naval commanders panicked. The entire Union blockade depended on wooden warships that would be defenseless against an armored opponent. Secretary Wells convened the Ironclad Board in August 1861, inviting proposals for ironclad warships. Bushnell's meeting with Ericsson came at this critical moment. When Lincoln overruled the Ironclad Board's rejection, Wells authorized a contract for one experimental ironclad to be delivered within 100 days. The contract included a poison pill. If the vessel failed to meet specifications, Ericsson and his financial backers would forfeit payment and absorb all losses. Ericsson accepted the terms. He had waited 17 years for vindication. He would build his revolutionary warship or be ruined trying. Ericsson partnered with Cornelius de la Mater, owner of the de la Mater Iron Works in New York City, and Thomas F. Rowland of the Continental Iron Works in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, to build the vessel. Ericsson named it the Monitor, from the Latin word meaning one who admonishes, because he intended it to remind Southern rebels of their folly. Construction began in late October 1861 under Ericsson's relentless supervision. He worked 18-hour days, sleeping in his office, sketching modifications, and badgering contractors to accelerate production. The Monitor was 172 feet long with a 41-foot beam, displacing 987 tons. Its iron-plated deck sat only 18 inches above the waterline. The revolving turret, 9 feet high and 20 feet in diameter, was armored with 8 1-inch iron plates bolted together. Two 11-inch Dahlgren smoothbore guns occupied the turret, capable of firing 166-pound solid shot. The turret rotated on a central spindle using steam power, allowing the guns to fire in any direction without moving the ship. The pilot house, a small armored structure forward of the turret, provided protected visibility for the captain and helmsman. Every component required innovation. The turret's rotating mechanism used gears and a steam engine designed specifically for this purpose. The gun ports had iron shutters that opened only when firing, protecting the crew from enemy projectiles. The ventilation system used blowers to provide fresh air below deck, essential because the ship was almost entirely enclosed. The anchor well was protected by an iron shutter to prevent water ingress. The engines, two vibrating lever types designed by Ericsson, drove a single four-bladed iron propeller 9 feet in diameter. The smokestack was telescoping, retractable during combat to reduce target profile. Ericsson incorporated over 40 patentable innovations into the Monitor, each tested and refined through calculation and experimentation. Critics called the design bizarre, but Ericsson's calculations predicted it would float, maneuver, and fight exactly as intended. On January 30, 1862, the Monitor was launched at the Continental Iron Works in Brooklyn. Thousands gathered to watch, skeptical that the strange vessel would float. As the hull slid into the East River, it settled low in the water, exactly as Ericsson predicted. The turret, engines, and armaments were installed over the next 3 weeks. On February 25, 1862, the Monitor was commissioned into the U.S. Navy under command of Lieutenant John Worden. She had been completed in exactly 118 days, 18 days beyond Ericsson's 100-day promise, but still a remarkable achievement. Naval officers who inspected the vessel remained skeptical. The Monitor's radical design violated every principle of traditional naval architecture. Her low freeboard meant waves would wash over the deck constantly. Her limited speed, just 7 knots maximum, made her vulnerable to faster opponents. Her lack of sails meant she couldn't cruise long distances without replenishing coal. Critics predicted she would sink in her first storm or be destroyed in her first battle. On March 6, 1862, the Monitor departed New York under tow by the steam tug Sethlow, bound for Hampton Roads, Virginia, where Union warships were enforcing a blockade of Confederate ports. The voyage nearly ended in disaster. On March 7th, the Monitor encountered a storm off the New Jersey coast. Waves broke over the deck, flooding ventilation intakes and nearly swamping the engines. Water poured through gaps around the turret base and gun ports. The crew manned pumps desperately, bailing water while the engines choked on seawater spray. For hours, the Monitor floundered, tossed by waves, her crew convinced they would sink. But Ericsson's design held. The hull's watertight integrity prevented catastrophic flooding, and as the storm abated, the crew regained control. The Monitor continued south, arriving at Hampton Roads on the evening of March 8, 1862. As she approached, the crew saw flames and wreckage scattered across the water. The Confederate Ironclad Virginia had attacked that afternoon, destroying the USS Cumberland and USS Congress and leaving the USS Minnesota stranded on a sandbar. The Virginia had withdrawn with the tide, but would return at dawn to finish the Minnesota. The Monitor was the only Union vessel capable of stopping her. On March 9, 1862, at approximately 8 a.m., the Virginia steamed toward the grounded Minnesota, intending to destroy the helpless frigate. As the Virginia closed, a small, low shape moved between her and the Minnesota. Confederate sailors stared in confusion at the strange vessel, barely visible above the water. One officer reportedly exclaimed, "What is that?" The Monitor maneuvered to intercept, and at 8:45 a.m. fired her first shot at the Virginia from a range of perhaps 200 yards. The battle between ironclads had begun. For the next 4 hours, the two vessels circled, firing at point-blank range. The Monitor's 11-inch Dahlgrens pounded the Virginia's iron plating, denting but not penetrating the armor. The Virginia's rifled guns hammered the Monitor's turret, each impact reverberating like thunder inside the iron cylinder, but failing to breach the defenses. Neither ship could destroy the other. The Monitor's maneuverability allowed her to circle the slower Virginia, keeping the turret oriented toward the enemy while dodging ramming attempts. The Virginia's greater firepower and ram bow gave her advantages at close range, but she couldn't catch the more nimble Monitor. Around noon, a Virginia shell struck the Monitor's pilot house, exploding against the viewing slit and temporarily blinding Lieutenant Worden with iron splinters and powder burns. Worden ordered the Monitor to withdraw, and command passed to Lieutenant Samuel Green, who maneuvered cautiously while assessing Worden's injuries. During this brief disengagement, the Virginia withdrew toward Norfolk, her deep draft preventing pursuit into shallow water. The battle ended inconclusively. Neither ship was destroyed. The Minnesota survived. The Union blockade remained intact. Tactically, the engagement was a draw. Strategically, it was a Union victory. The Monitor had neutralized the Virginia, preventing Confederate control of Hampton Roads and preserving the naval blockade that would eventually strangle the Confederacy economically. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that wooden warships were obsolete. Within months, navies worldwide were commissioning ironclads, adopting Ericsson's rotating turret concept and redesigning fleets for the new era of armored naval combat. News of the battle electrified the nation. Northern newspapers celebrated the Monitor as the savior of the Union Navy, praising Ericsson as a genius whose revolutionary design had vindicated his decades of dismissed proposals. The Cheesebox on a Raft, as critics had mockingly called it, had proven superior to conventional ironclads. The rotating turret, dismissed as impractical, had allowed the Monitor to engage from any angle without maneuvering the entire ship. The low profile, ridiculed as unseaworthy, had presented minimal target area and survived hours of pounding. Ericsson's calculations, questioned by admirals and engineers, had been validated under the ultimate test: combat. The naval establishment that had rejected him for 17 years now begged for more Monitor-class vessels. By war's end, the Union Navy had commissioned over 60 Monitors based on Ericsson's design, each incorporating improvements and modifications, but retaining the fundamental concept of low-profile hull and rotating turret. The Monitor remained in service until December 31, 1862, when she foundered in a storm off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, while under tow to Beaufort. 16 of her 62-man crew died in the sinking, drowning in the darkness as waves swept over the low deck. The loss was tragic but predictable. The Monitor's low freeboard, ideal for combat, made her vulnerable to storms. Ericsson had warned that Monitors were coastal vessels, unsuitable for open ocean operations, but the Navy ordered her south anyway. The Monitor's wreck lay undiscovered until 1973, when researchers located her remains in 240 feet of water. Over subsequent decades, components including the engines, propeller, and turret were recovered and are now displayed at the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, where visitors can see the revolutionary technology that changed naval warfare. Ericsson continued designing warships and engines for the next 26 years, producing numerous Monitor variants and experimental vessels. The U.S. Navy purchased several of his later designs, and foreign navies, particularly Sweden and Russia, commissioned Monitors for coastal defense. Ericsson never married. His brief marriage to Amelia Byam in England had ended in separation, and they never reconciled. He lived alone in New York City, working constantly, rejecting social invitations, and dedicating himself entirely to engineering. Colleagues described him as brilliant, demanding, temperamental, and utterly committed to his designs. He was vindictive toward those who wronged him, particularly Stockton, and generous toward those who supported him, particularly Delameter. He was a Swedish patriot who never fully embraced American culture, maintaining correspondence in Swedish and following European affairs closely. He died on March 8, 1889, exactly 27 years, to the day after the Monitor's battle at Hampton Roads. Perhaps fitting symmetry for a man whose greatest achievement was that revolutionary ironclad. Ericsson's legacy extends far beyond the Monitor. The rotating gun turret, dismissed as impractical in 1861, became standard on every battleship built in the late 19th and 20th centuries. The concept of armored, low-profile warships influenced destroyer and submarine design. The principle of placing engines below the waterline to protect them from shell fire became universal. Modern naval architecture traces direct lineage to Ericsson's innovations, which overthrew centuries of accumulated wisdom about how warships should be built. The Cheesebox on a Raft, ridiculed by admirals and mocked by skeptics, became the template for every capital ship that followed. Ericsson's vindication was complete, though it came too late to erase the bitterness of decades spent fighting for recognition. The Monitor's battle with the Virginia demonstrated a pattern repeated throughout history. Watson-Watt's radar was dismissed until it saved Britain. Mitchell's Spitfire was mocked until it defended the skies. Brunel's ships were called extravagant until they connected continents. Harrison's chronometer was rejected until it solved navigation. Semmelweis's hand-washing was ridiculed until it saved mothers. The Wright brothers were ignored until their planes changed warfare. Goddard's rockets were mocked until they reached space. Hillemann's vaccines broke rules until they saved millions. Borlaug's wheat was opposed until it prevented famine. Marshall drank bacteria to prove ulcers were infectious. Fleming published penicillin and was ignored for a decade. And Ericsson's Ironclad was called Folly until it changed naval warfare forever. Each innovator faced rejection, skepticism, and hostility from established authorities. Each persisted despite opposition, and each was vindicated when circumstances forced recognition. The Cheesebox on a raft sailed into history at Hampton Roads, proving that radical innovation, properly engineered, could defeat conventional wisdom. The admirals who rejected Ericsson's design were forced to commission dozens of monitors. The critics who called it impractical were silenced by combat results. And the man who had endured 17 years of obscurity after the Princeton disaster became celebrated as one of the great naval architects in history. Ericsson's Monitor didn't just win a battle, it obsoleted an entire paradigm of naval warfare. Wooden ships, masts, sails, and broadside tactics gave way to iron armor, steam propulsion, and turreted guns. The transformation was so rapid and complete that within a decade, no major navy operated wooden warships. Ericsson's Cheesebox had changed the world. The Raft had become a revolution.